In the quiet hours of history, when the world settles into its ancient rhythms, there are stories that whisper across millennia. Stories of displacement, of longing, of faith tested in foreign lands. Tonight, we journey together into one of humanity's most profound experiences, the reality of exile. Picture, if you will, the banks of distant rivers where a people once sat and wept, remembering a home that seemed as distant as the stars. Imagine the weight of carrying an entire identity in your heart when everything familiar has been stripped away. This is the story of biblical exile, not merely a historical event, but a deeply human experience that shaped faith, culture, and the very soul of a people. From the deportations to Babylon and Assyria, to the scattered communities along the Nile, we'll explore how exile became both a crucible of suffering and a forge of resilience. We'll walk through the daily rhythms of displaced lives, witness the courage of those who maintained their identity in foreign courts, and discover how hope was preserved in clay and parchment across generations. So before we begin our journey, feel free to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy these explorations of faith and history. And let me know in the comments what story of resilience resonates with you. It's always wonderful to see how these ancient experiences still speak to us today. Now, let's find a quiet space in our hearts and minds and step gently into the world of the exiled. Verse 1, Daily Life Immersion. By the waters of Babylon, daily life in captivity. The morning sun rises over the Euphrates, casting long shadows across the mud brick houses of Tel Aviv. It's been 15 years since the walls of Jerusalem fell. 15 years since the long march eastward began. But here, in this settlement outside Babylon, life has found its rhythm again different. Quieter, marked by an ache that never quite disappears. Sarah rises before dawn, as she has every morning since arriving in this place. Her hands move automatically through the familiar motions, kneading the barley bread, checking the small clay lamp that burns perpetually in the corner. A reminder of the temple light that once burned in Jerusalem. The bread is different here. The grain tastes of foreign soil, and sometimes she catches herself wondering if the bread of home would taste strange now, after all these years. Her husband Ezra has already left for the construction site, where he labors alongside other exiles, building the very walls and waterways that strengthen their captor's empire. It's honest work, and it pays enough to keep their small family fed. But there's an irony in it that weighs on him: Jewish hands building Babylonian glory, exiled skills strengthening the nation that destroyed their temple. The children are different here. Sarah's youngest, born in exile, speaks Aramaic as naturally as Hebrew. Sometimes she catches him playing with the Babylonian children, laughing at jokes she doesn't understand, and she feels the strange tension of gratitude and loss. He's adapting, surviving, even thriving in some ways. But he'll never know the feeling of Jerusalem's stones beneath his feet, never experience the pilgrimage festivals as she once did. By mid-morning, the settlement comes alive with the subdued bustle of a community that has learned to live with quiet dignity. The market operates much like markets everywhere: vendors calling their wares, women examining vegetables, children darting between the stalls. But listen carefully, and you'll hear the differences. Hebrew mingles with Aramaic and Akkadian. Prices are calculated in Babylonian currency. The foods themselves tell the story of adaptation, familiar recipes altered by available ingredients, new flavors gradually accepted into the rhythm of daily sustenance. The most profound differences, though, are in the silences. There's no trumpet call to temple service, no procession of pilgrims, no incense rising from the holy precincts. Instead, there are the improvised rhythms of exile worship. Small groups gather in homes, sharing memories of Jerusalem, teaching children songs their grandparents sang in Zion. The Sabbath is observed, but it feels like an act of preservation rather than participation in a living tradition. Old Mordecai, who was a scribe in the temple before the destruction, has become something of a keeper of memory. Each afternoon, he he sits under the shade of a date palm, and children gather to hear stories of the homeland. He describes the beauty of Solomon's temple, the sound of the great bronze sea, the sight of the high priest emerging from the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur. His voice carries the weight of someone who knows these memories must be passed down, or they will disappear like smoke. The altar was made of acacia wood, he tells them, his weathered hands gesturing as if he could rebuild it from memory, overlaid with bronze, with horns at each corner. And the fire never went out. Day and night, it burned for the Lord. The children listen with the intensity of those who are learning not just facts, but identity itself. The women have their own ways of maintaining connection. They gather at the river's edge in the evening as the day's heat subsides. Officially, they're doing laundry, but really, they're sharing the deeper work of keeping hope alive. They speak of sisters left behind, of parents who died in the siege, of children who didn't survive the journey. But they also speak of small miracles, a letter received from Jerusalem, news of relatives who escaped to Egypt, a dream that felt like a message from the Almighty. It's here, by the waters of Babylon, that some of the most heart-wrenching prayers in human history are whispered. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. The psalm captures not just the moment, but the ongoing reality of exile existence. The rivers are beautiful. The Euphrates runs wide and strong, supporting fertile lands and thriving cities. But they're not the Jordan. The cities are magnificent. Babylon's hanging gardens are already legendary. Its temples reach toward heaven. But they're not Jerusalem. The work rhythms of exile are complex. Many of the exiles are skilled craftsmen, scribes, or merchants. The Babylonians aren't foolish. They've brought valuable people to strengthen their empire. Ezra, Sarah's husband, was a stonemason in Jerusalem. Here, he's part of the massive construction projects that are transforming Babylon into the wonder of the world. Jewish metalworkers forge weapons and tools. Jewish scribes keep records and accounts. Jewish merchants establish trade networks that span the known world. There's advancement possible here, even prosperity. Some exiles have risen to positions of significant responsibility. They own homes, accumulate wealth, gain respect in their communities. But success in exile carries its own burden. Each achievement is shadowed by the question, are we building a life here, or are we meant to be temporary sojourners? The most difficult moments come during the Babylonian festivals. The city erupts in celebration music, processions, elaborate ceremonies honoring Marduk, and the pantheon of Mesopotamian gods. The exiles are expected to participate, at least publicly. It's a test of loyalty, of integration. Some comply fully, reasoning that survival requires adaptation. Others find ways to be present without participating, maintaining their distinctiveness while avoiding confrontation. But there are also moments of unexpected grace. A Babylonian neighbor brings soup when illness strikes the household. A supervisor at the construction site shows unusual kindness. A merchant offers favorable terms to help a struggling family. These small bridges between communities remind everyone that exile, while painful, doesn't have to mean isolation. The children, especially, become bridges between worlds. They translate not just languages, but cultures. They help their parents navigate Babylonian bureaucracy, interpret local customs, understand the unwritten rules of survival in a foreign land. But they also carry the weight of being living connections to two worlds, the world of their parents' memories and the world of their own daily experience. As the sun sets over the Euphrates, painting the mud brick houses in shades of gold and amber, the exile community settles into its evening rhythms. Lamps are lit, marking the transition from the public world of Babylonian commerce to the private world of Hebrew memory. Prayers are whispered, songs hummed, stories told. The day's work in the empire's service gives way to the night's work of keeping faith alive. This is the daily reality of exile, not the dramatic moments of prophecy and resistance that capture our attention, but the quiet, persistent work of maintaining identity in a foreign land. It's the story of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, preserving hope in the face of displacement, maintaining faith when the temple lies in ruins, raising children to know who they are, even when everything familiar has been stripped away. In the gentle sounds of the evening, babies crying, mothers singing lullabies, fathers discussing the day's work, we hear the deep resilience of the human spirit. This is how exile is survived. One day at a time, one meal at a time, one prayer at a time, one story at a time. This is how identity is preserved when everything else is lost. Verse 2. Biography event narrative. Daniel in the courts of Babylon, in the heart of Babylon's royal quarter, where the morning light filters through latticed windows onto polished stone floors. A young man named Daniel prepares for another day in the most powerful court on earth. It's been 3 years since he was brought here as a captive, 3 years since his world changed forever. Yet standing in the corridor outside the throne room, dressed in the fine linen befitting a royal advisor, he carries himself with a quiet dignity that speaks of something unbroken within. Daniel's story begins not with triumph, but with loss. He was among the first wave of exiles taken from Jerusalem, part of that initial deportation, when King Nebuchadnezzar decided to drain Judah of its most promising young people. The Babylonian strategy was both cruel and clever. Take the brightest minds, the most capable leaders, the youth with the greatest potential, and remake them into servants of the empire. Picture that moment of selection royal officials moving through the noble houses of Jerusalem, evaluating young men like prized livestock. They looked for those who were without blemish, of good appearance, skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace. Daniel, along with his companions Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, met these criteria perfectly. But what the Babylonians couldn't have anticipated was the depth of awe, faith that would sustain these young men through their transformation. As they were marched eastward, away from everything they'd ever known, Daniel and his friends made a choice that would define their entire experience in exile. They would serve their captors faithfully, but they would not abandon their God. The first test came almost immediately. In the palace, they were enrolled in a 3-year program designed to remake them entirely. They were given new names. Daniel became Belteshazzar, Hananiah became Shadrach, Mishael became Meshach, and Azariah became Abednego. These weren't merely new labels. They were new identities, connecting them to Babylonian gods and severing their ties to their Hebrew heritage. The education was comprehensive and seductive. They learned the language and literature of the Chaldeans, studied the complex astronomical calculations that made Babylon the center of ancient learning, mastered the intricate bureaucracy that governed the largest empire the world had ever seen. This wasn't mere training, it was systematic cultural conversion, designed to produce capable servants who would think like Babylonians, feel like Babylonians, and ultimately become Babylonians. But Daniel found ways to resist without rebelling. When the royal food and wine were offered delicacies that would have been unimaginable luxuries in Jerusalem, Daniel politely declined. The food, you see, would have been prepared according to Babylonian customs, likely dedicated to their gods, certainly not prepared according to the dietary laws that marked Hebrew identity. It was a small act of defiance, but one that preserved something essential about who he was. The palace steward was nervous. These young men were his responsibility, and if they appeared weak or sickly, it would reflect poorly on his care. But Daniel proposed a test. Give us vegetables to eat and water to drink for 10 days, and see how we compare to the others. It was a request wrapped in respect, a challenge presented as cooperation. The result was remarkable. After 10 days, Daniel and his friends appeared healthier and better nourished than those who had eaten the royal food. It was perhaps a small miracle, or perhaps simply the result of clean living and divine blessing. Either way, it established a pattern that would characterize Daniel's entire career. Faithful service combined with uncompromising faithfulness to his God. As the 3 years of training concluded, Daniel and his companions were brought before King Nebuchadnezzar for final examination. The king found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. They had mastered the Babylonian curriculum without losing their Hebrew souls. They had become valuable servants without becoming spiritual slaves. Daniel's rise through the ranks of the Babylonian court was swift and remarkable. His gift for interpreting dreams, a skill highly valued in a culture obsessed with omens and divine messages, brought him to the king's attention repeatedly. But it was his response to the king's impossible demand that truly established his reputation. Nebuchadnezzar had a dream that troubled him deeply, but when he woke, he couldn't remember it. Worse, he demanded that his wise men not only interpret the dream, but first tell him what he had dreamed. It was an impossible request, a test designed to expose the fraudulence of the royal advisors. When they protested that no king had ever made such a demand, Nebuchadnezzar flew into a rage and ordered the execution of all the wise men in Babylon. Daniel, now counted among the king's advisors, was marked for death along with the rest. But instead of panicking, he did something characteristically bold. He requested time to provide the king with both the dream and its interpretation. It was an extraordinary act of faith, promising to do what the most skilled enchanters in the empire had declared impossible. That night, Daniel and his friends gathered for prayer. They had learned to navigate the complex politics of the Babylonian court, but they had never forgotten where their ultimate loyalty lay. As they prayed, the dream and its meaning were revealed to Daniel in a vision. The relief, the gratitude, the overwhelming sense of divine intervention. Imagine the intensity of that moment. When Daniel returned to the king, he was careful to give credit where it was due. No wise men, enchanters, magicians, or astrologers can show to the king the mystery that the king has asked. He said, "But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries." Then he proceeded to describe the dream in perfect detail. A great statue with a head of gold, chest and arms of silver, middle and thighs of bronze, legs of iron, and feet partly of iron and partly of clay. The interpretation was even more remarkable. Daniel explained that the statue represented a succession of kingdoms, with Babylon as the head of gold. But all earthly kingdoms, no matter how powerful, would eventually be replaced by an eternal kingdom established by the God of heaven. It was a message of both validation and limitation. Nebuchadnezzar's empire was indeed magnificent, but it was also temporary. The king's response was immediate and overwhelming. He fell on his face before Daniel and commanded that offerings be made to him. Daniel had done more than save his own life and the lives of his fellow advisors. He had demonstrated the reality and power of the God of Israel in the very heart of the pagan empire. Daniel's subsequent career was marked by a series of similar moments, times when his faithfulness to his God proved to be not a liability, but an asset in his service to earthly rulers. Under Nebuchadnezzar, he rose to become ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief prefect over all the wise men. When Nebuchadnezzar's madness struck, Daniel was there to interpret the signs. When Belshazzar saw the handwriting on the wall, it was Daniel who read the divine message. But perhaps the most famous test of Daniel's faith came during the reign of Darius the Persian, after the Babylonian Empire had fallen. By this time, Daniel was an old man, a survivor of multiple regime changes, a living bridge between the world of his youth and the world of his old age. His competence and integrity had made him valuable to successive rulers, but they had also made him enemies among those who resented his influence. The plot against Daniel was cleverly designed. His enemies knew they couldn't catch him in corruption or incompetence. His record was spotless. So they crafted a trap that would force him to choose between his service to the king and his service to his God. they convinced King Darius to sign a decree that for 30 days, no one could petition any god or man except the king himself. Daniel's response was characteristic. He didn't organize a protest or seek a loophole. He simply continued his established practice of praying 3 times a day, with his windows open toward Jerusalem. It was a quiet act of defiance, visible to anyone who cared to look, but conducted with the same dignity that had marked his entire career. When he was inevitably arrested and brought before the king, Darius was heartbroken. He had been manipulated into signing what amounted to a death warrant for one of his most trusted advisors. But the law of the Medes and Persians could not be changed, and Daniel was thrown into the lion's den. That night, as Daniel lay among the lions, the king couldn't sleep. At the first light of dawn, he hurried to the den and called out with anguish in his voice, "O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions?" Daniel's response from the depths of the pit carries across the centuries. "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him. And also before you, O king, I have done no harm." The king's joy was boundless. Daniel was lifted from the pit unharmed, and his accusers were thrown to the lions in his place. But more than that, King Darius issued a decree throughout his empire. "I make a decree that in all my royal dominion, people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, enduring forever." Daniel's story is remarkable not just for its dramatic moments, but for what it reveals about the possibility of faithful living in exile. He shows us that it's possible to serve earthly masters with excellence while maintaining ultimate loyalty to a higher authority. He demonstrates that integrity in small matters prepares us for faithfulness in great trials. He proves that our circumstances, no matter how challenging, cannot separate us from our God. Throughout his long career, Daniel never forgot who he was or where he came from. In his private chambers, he continued to pray toward Jerusalem. In his public service, he maintained the ethical standards of his Hebrew upbringing. In his personal relationships, he showed the same loyalty to his friends that he showed to his God. But perhaps most importantly, Daniel's story reminds us that exile can become a platform for witness. His faithfulness didn't just preserve his own integrity, it revealed the reality of God to successive pagan rulers. Through Daniel, the God of Israel became known in the courts of Babylon and Persia. Through Daniel, the faith of a small, conquered people proved more powerful than the gods of mighty empires. As we leave Daniel in his final years, still serving faithfully in the court of Cyrus the Persian, we're left with a profound example of how to live with integrity in a world that often demands compromise. His story echoes through the centuries, reminding all who find themselves far from home that faithfulness is possible, that integrity can be maintained, and that even in the darkest moments, we are never truly alone. The lions' mouths were shut, but more than that, hearts were open to the reality of the living God. Verse 3, Mystery, Culture, Technology, Deep Dive, Cuneiform and Covenant, How Exiles Recorded Hope. In a modest workshop in the Jewish quarter of Babylon, an elderly scribe named Baruch ben Neriah sits hunched over a clay tablet, his weathered fingers guiding a reed stylus with practiced precision. The wedge-shaped marks he presses into the soft clay are cuneiform, the writing system of his captors, but the words he's recording are Hebrew prophecies, sacred texts that must be preserved for future generations. This is the quiet miracle of exile. How a displaced people used the very tools of their conquerors to keep their faith alive. The story of how hope was recorded in exile is far more complex and fascinating than we might imagine. It's not simply about scribes copying texts in hidden chambers. It's about the collision of writing systems, the adaptation of technologies, and the desperate, creative ways that identity was preserved when everything else seemed lost. When the exiles arrived in Babylon, they encountered a civilization that had been perfecting the art of writing for over 1,000 years. Cuneiform, with its wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay, was the dominant script throughout Mesopotamia. It was used for everything from royal chronicles to shopping lists, from religious texts to love letters. The Babylonians had developed sophisticated techniques for creating durable tablets that could last for centuries, and they had established vast libraries and archives that preserved the accumulated knowledge of their empire. But the Hebrew exiles brought their own writing tradition, one that was fundamentally different from the cuneiform system. Hebrew was written in an alphabetic script on materials like papyrus and leather. The writing ran from right to left, and the language had its own unique grammatical structures and vocabulary. Most importantly, Hebrew was the language of covenant, the sacred tongue in which God had revealed himself to their ancestors. The challenge facing the exiles was profound. How do you preserve a Hebrew religious tradition in a world dominated by Babylonian literacy? How do you maintain the integrity of sacred texts when you're forced to use foreign tools and materials? How do you pass on the essence of your faith to children who are growing up bilingual, bicultural, and sometimes confused about their identity? The solutions they developed were ingenious and varied. Some scribes learned to write Hebrew using cuneiform symbols, creating a hybrid script that could be read by Hebrew speakers, but looked Babylonian to casual observers. Others developed new techniques for writing Hebrew on clay tablets, adapting the traditional right-to-left direction to the horizontal format preferred by Babylonian scribes. But perhaps the most remarkable innovation was the development of what we might call memory tablets, clay records that weren't meant to be permanent archives, but rather training tools for preserving oral traditions. These tablets contained abbreviated versions of Hebrew texts, mnemonic devices to help memorize longer passages, and sometimes even musical notations to preserve the traditional melodies that accompanied sacred songs. Ezra the scribe, working in his small workshop, represents thousands of anonymous preservers of tradition. His day begins before dawn, when the clay is still cool and workable. He prepares his materials carefully. The clay must be just the right consistency, neither too wet nor too dry. His stylus is cut from a reed that grows along the Euphrates, shaped to create the precise wedge marks that cuneiform requires. But watch closely as Ezra works, and you'll notice something remarkable. While he's using Babylonian tools and techniques, he's adapting them to preserve Hebrew content. When he writes the name of God, he pauses reverently, sometimes switching to a different stylus that makes finer marks. When he records a passage from the Torah, he checks it against a worn leather scroll that he keeps hidden in a wooden box, one of the few texts that survived the journey from Jerusalem. The process is painstakingly slow. A single psalm might take days to complete, not because the writing is difficult, but because accuracy is paramount. Every word must be perfect, every letter precise. These aren't just documents. They're lifelines connecting the present generation to their spiritual heritage. The materials themselves tell a story of adaptation and loss. In Jerusalem, scribes worked primarily with papyrus imported from Egypt and parchment made from animal skins. These materials were expensive, but perfect for Hebrew writing smooth, durable, and capable of preserving the flowing lines of Hebrew script. In Babylon, papyrus was rare and expensive, while parchment was almost impossible to obtain. Clay tablets, the standard Babylonian writing material, presented unique challenges for Hebrew texts. The wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform were perfect for recording the syllabic structure of Akkadian, the Babylonian language, but Hebrew's alphabetic system required different techniques. Some scribes developed modified cuneiform symbols that could represent Hebrew letters. Others created entirely new symbol systems that combined Hebrew and Babylonian elements. The results were sometimes beautiful, sometimes crude, but always poignant. Imagine holding a clay tablet that contains the words of Psalm 137. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. The irony is overwhelming. a lament about exile written in the very script and on the very material of the exiling empire. But the preservation of text was only part of the challenge. The exiles also had to find ways to preserve the oral traditions that surrounded their written texts. Hebrew worship wasn't just about reading words. It was about singing, chanting, and reciting in specific ways that connected the worshiper to centuries of tradition. This is where the most creative solutions emerged. Some scribes developed systems for notating Hebrew melodies using adapted cuneiform symbols. Others created what we might call performance notes, instructions embedded in the text that reminded readers how passages should be sung or recited. These weren't just academic exercises. They were desperate attempts to preserve the full sensory experience of Hebrew worship. The workshop of Baruch ben Neriah also serves as an informal school where young exiles learn to read and write Hebrew. But the education that takes place here is more than literacy training. It's cultural preservation. As students practice forming Hebrew letters on clay tablets, they're also learning the stories that give those letters meaning. As they memorize passages from the Torah, they're also absorbing the worldview that makes those passages sacred. The teaching methods reflect the constraints of exile. In Jerusalem, students might have learned Hebrew using scrolls and parchment, copying texts in the traditional manner. Here, they learn using clay tablets and adapted techniques. But the content remains pure, the same stories, the same laws, the same poetry that their ancestors treasured. One of the most remarkable aspects of this preservation effort was its distributed nature. Unlike the centralized scriptoriums of medieval monasteries, the Hebrew writing in exile was carried out in dozens of small workshops, private homes, and informal schools scattered throughout the Jewish quarters of Babylon. Each scribe worked independently, but they were all connected by a shared mission, ensuring that Hebrew faith would survive the exile. This distributed approach had both advantages and risks. On one hand, it meant that if one workshop was discovered and shut down, others would continue the work. On the other hand, it raised concerns about accuracy and consistency. How could they ensure that texts copied in different workshops remained identical? How could they prevent errors from creeping in and multiplying? The solution was a network of verification and correction. Scribes would regularly gather to compare their work, checking texts against each other and against the few authoritative manuscripts that had survived from Jerusalem. These meetings were risky large gatherings of Hebrew scribes could attract unwanted attention from Babylonian authorities, but they were essential for maintaining textual integrity. The preservation work wasn't limited to religious texts. The exiles also recorded historical chronicles, genealogies, and legal documents that would be essential for maintaining their identity and eventually reclaiming their homeland. They created detailed records of who had been taken from which families, which priestly lines had survived, and which tribal territories would need to be restored. Some of these records were hidden in sealed jars, following the ancient practice of burying important documents for future recovery. Others were incorporated into seemingly innocent Babylonian documents. Genealogies disguised as tax records, territorial claims embedded in commercial contracts. The exiles became masters of what we might call steganography, the art of hiding meaningful information within innocuous-looking documents. The most ambitious preservation project was the creation of comprehensive collections of Hebrew texts that could serve as portable libraries. These weren't single books, but rather coordinated sets of tablets or scrolls that contained the essential elements of Hebrew faith and culture. Creating these collections required enormous resources and coordination, but they represented the exiles' best hope for preserving their heritage intact. The work was dangerous as well as difficult. The Babylonian authorities were generally tolerant of local religious practices, but they were suspicious of any activities that might foster rebellion or resistance. Hebrew scribes had to be careful not to record anything that could be interpreted as seditious. They developed coded language and symbolic references that would be meaningless to Babylonian readers, but clearly understood by Hebrew speakers. For example, references to the Day of the Lord or the restoration of Zion were often disguised as general religious language or embedded in seemingly innocent prayers. Maps showing the boundaries of Israel were disguised as genealogical charts. Lists of military leaders were recorded as priestly genealogies. As the years passed, the preservation work evolved and expanded. The first generation of exiles focused on simply recording what they remembered from Jerusalem. The second generation began to interpret and expand these texts, adding commentaries and explanations that helped younger readers understand their heritage. The third generation started to organize and systematize the accumulated materials, creating the foundations for what would eventually become the Hebrew Bible as we know it. The irony of this preservation effort is profound. The Babylonians had intended to destroy Hebrew identity by removing the people from their land and immersing them in Babylonian culture. Instead, the exile forced the Hebrews to develop more sophisticated and portable ways of preserving their faith. In Jerusalem, Hebrew identity was tied to specific places: the temple, the holy city, the promised land. In exile, Hebrew identity became more abstract and therefore more transportable. The texts preserved in Babylon became the foundation for Jewish communities that would eventually spread throughout the ancient world. The techniques developed for preserving Hebrew texts in a foreign environment became the model for maintaining Jewish identity in diaspora communities that would persist for centuries. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this preservation effort was its emotional dimension. These weren't just academic exercises in textual criticism. They were acts of faith performed under conditions of enormous stress and uncertainty. Every Hebrew letter pressed into Babylonian clay was a declaration of hope. Every psalm copied onto foreign material was an act of resistance. Every student taught to read Hebrew was a bridge to a future that might never come. The elderly scribes who carried out this work knew that they might never see Jerusalem again. They preserved texts describing temple rituals they would never perform, recorded geographical details of a land they might never inhabit, and taught songs of pilgrimage they would never sing. Their work was an act of faith in the future, a bet that someday, somehow, their people would return home and need these texts to rebuild their shattered world. In the end, the preservation of Hebrew texts in Babylonian exile represents one of history's greatest acts of cultural resilience. Using the tools of their conquerors, adapting to foreign materials and techniques, working under constant threat of discovery and punishment, a small community of scribes and teachers managed to preserve the essential elements of their civilization. The clay tablets they created, the scrolls they copied, the techniques they developed, all of these became the foundation for the Hebrew Bible as we know it today. Their work ensured that when the exile finally ended, the returning exiles would have the textual foundation they needed to rebuild their temple, their law, and their identity. The stylus marks pressed into Babylonian clay carried within them the hope of return, the promise of restoration, and the unshakable faith that their God had not abandoned them in their darkest hour. Verse 4. Contrasting perspective, overlooked world, the empire's view. How Babylon managed the exiled. In the great administrative palace of Babylon, where the morning sun streams through high windows onto polished floors, a Babylonian official named Naburi-Mani prepares for his weekly review of the empire's resettlement policies. His desk is covered with clay tablets bearing the wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform script population records, production reports, and cultural assessments from the various exile communities scattered throughout the empire. To him, these aren't stories of displaced people's longing for home. They're data points in one of history's most sophisticated experiments in imperial management. The Babylonian approach to exile wasn't driven by cruelty or religious persecution, though it certainly caused immense suffering. It was, from their perspective, a rational solution to the persistent problem of imperial governance. How do you manage a vast, A diverse empire filled with conquered peoples who might rebel at any moment? How do you transform enemies into productive citizens? How do you break the back of resistance without destroying the very populations that make your empire wealthy and powerful? Nabu-Rimani's morning routine reflects the bureaucratic sophistication of Babylonian administration. He begins by reviewing the deportation records from the previous year, detailed lists of who was taken from which cities, their occupations, their family structures, and their assigned locations within the empire. These aren't random acts of violence. They're carefully planned population transfers designed to achieve specific strategic goals. The selection process for deportation was particularly calculated. The Babylonians didn't simply empty conquered cities. They performed what we might call strategic demographic surgery. They identified and removed the people most likely to organize resistance: political leaders, religious authorities, skilled craftsmen, and young men of military age. But they also identified and preserved the people most likely to contribute to imperial prosperity: merchants, scribes, artisans, and skilled workers. The Hebrew exiles from Jerusalem fit perfectly into this pattern. King Nebuchadnezzar's officials had carefully selected the most capable and educated members of Judean society. They took the royal family, the priestly elite, the skilled craftsmen, and the educated youth. They left behind the rural population, the elderly, and those considered too poor or unskilled to be worth transporting. From the Babylonian perspective, this wasn't an act of destruction, but of acquisition. They were harvesting human resources from conquered territories and redistributing them where they would be most beneficial to the empire. The Hebrew exiles weren't prisoners. They were involuntary immigrants being given the opportunity to contribute to the greatest civilization on earth. The resettlement policies were equally sophisticated. The Babylonians didn't simply dump exile populations into random locations. They created what we might call managed communities, settlements designed to maximize productivity while minimizing the risk of rebellion. These communities were large enough to maintain some cultural identity and internal support systems, but not so large as to become potential centers of resistance. The location choices were strategic. Many exile communities were placed near major construction projects where their skills would be most valuable. Others were located along trade routes where they could contribute to commercial activity. Still others were positioned in agricultural areas where they could help increase food production. The Hebrew settlement at Tel Aviv, for example, was located near major canal systems where their engineering and construction skills would be immediately useful. The integration policies were perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of the Babylonian system. Rather than attempting to completely erase the cultural identities of exile populations, the Babylonians developed what we might call controlled assimilation. They allowed conquered peoples to maintain certain cultural practices while gradually incorporating them into Babylonian society. This approach is evident in the treatment of Hebrew religious practices. The Babylonians didn't forbid Hebrew worship, but they did require that it be conducted in ways that didn't challenge imperial authority. Hebrew communities could gather for prayer and study, but they couldn't engage in activities that might be interpreted as seditious. They could preserve their religious texts, but they couldn't use them to promote resistance against Babylonian rule. The naming policies reveal the subtlety of this approach. When promising young exiles like Daniel and his friends were selected for royal service, they were given Babylonian names that connected them to Babylonian gods. But these new names didn't completely replace their Hebrew names. They existed alongside them. The message was clear. You can maintain your heritage, but you must also embrace your new identity as Babylonian citizens. The economic integration of exile populations was equally sophisticated. The Babylonians recognized that displaced peoples could become either assets or liabilities, depending on how they were managed. Successful integration required providing exiles with meaningful work that utilized their skills while contributing to imperial prosperity. Hebrew exiles were particularly valuable because of their high literacy rates and technical skills. Many were employed as scribes, administrators, and technical specialists in the vast Babylonian bureaucracy. Others were put to work on major construction projects, where their engineering and architectural knowledge proved invaluable. Still others were incorporated into the commercial networks that connected Babylon to the far reaches of the empire. The promotion of individuals like Daniel to high-ranking positions wasn't simply a reward for exceptional service. It was part of a broader strategy of creating stakeholders within exile communities. By giving talented exiles opportunities for advancement, the Babylonians created incentives for cooperation and integration. Why would someone plot rebellion when they had achieved success and status within the existing system? The monitoring systems were extensive, but generally subtle. Rather than maintaining obvious surveillance over exile communities, the Babylonians developed networks of informants and cultural intermediaries who could provide early warning of potential problems. These weren't necessarily spies in the traditional sense. They were often community leaders who had genuinely embraced their new Babylonian identity and saw reporting suspicious activities as a civic duty. The cultural policies were particularly nuanced. The Babylonians recognized that attempting to completely suppress exile cultures would likely provoke resistance. Instead, they developed policies that allowed for cultural expression while channeling it in directions that supported imperial stability. Hebrew communities, for example, were allowed to maintain their religious practices, but they were encouraged to interpret those practices in ways that emphasized loyalty to earthly rulers and acceptance of divine providence. The message was subtle but clear. Your God has placed you under Babylonian rule, and faithful service to the empire is a form of religious obedience. The education policies reveal the long-term thinking behind Babylonian exile management. Rather than simply exploiting the current generation of exiles, the Babylonians were investing in their children and grandchildren. Young exiles were given access to the best education available in the empire, learning not only practical skills, but also the cultural values that would make them loyal Babylonian citizens. This education was comprehensive and seductive. Students learned the Babylonian language, literature, and history. They studied the achievements of Babylonian civilization, the wisdom of Babylonian philosophers, and the glory of Babylonian military conquests. They were taught to see themselves as fortunate beneficiaries of Babylonian generosity, rather than as victims of imperial conquest. The success of this approach is evident in the careers of individuals like Daniel, who rose to positions of enormous responsibility within the Babylonian government. From the imperial perspective, Daniel represented the ideal outcome of exile management, a skilled, loyal, and productive citizen who contributed to imperial prosperity while maintaining just enough of his original identity to serve as a bridge to his community. The diplomatic aspects of exile management were equally sophisticated. The Babylonians understood that successful integration required more than just policies and procedures. It required winning the psychological consent of exile populations. This meant demonstrating that life under Babylonian rule could be prosperous, secure, and dignified. The magnificent city of Babylon itself served as a powerful tool of persuasion. Exiles arriving from smaller, less developed cities were overwhelmed by the scale and sophistication of Babylonian civilization. The hanging gardens, the massive walls, the elaborate temples, the bustling markets, all of these sent a clear message about the benefits of imperial citizenship. The legal protections extended to exile populations were also significant. While exiles didn't enjoy the same rights as native Babylonians, they were protected by imperial law and had access to legal remedies for grievances. This was far more protection than most conquered peoples could expect from their conquerors, and it helped create a sense of security that made integration more attractive. The religious tolerance policies were particularly important for managing populations with strong religious identities. The Babylonians didn't attempt to convert exiles to Babylonian religion. nor did they prohibit the worship of foreign gods. Instead, they developed a syncretic approach that allowed for multiple religious loyalties while ensuring that imperial authority remained supreme. This approach is evident in the way Babylonian rulers, like Nebuchadnezzar and Cyrus, dealt with Hebrew religious practices. They didn't prohibit Hebrew worship, but they did expect Hebrew communities to acknowledge the authority of Babylonian gods and rulers. They allowed Hebrew festivals and ceremonies, but they required that these activities be conducted in ways that didn't challenge imperial sovereignty. The long-term success of Babylonian exile management is evident in the fact that many exile communities chose to remain in Babylon even after they were given permission to return to their homelands. When Cyrus the Persian conquered Babylon and issued his famous decree allowing exiled peoples to return home, only a fraction of the Hebrew exiles chose to make the journey back to Jerusalem. This choice wasn't simply about comfort or convenience. It reflected the success of Babylonian integration policies. After 2 or 3 generations in exile, many Hebrews had developed deep roots in Babylonian society. They had established successful businesses, built comfortable homes, and created networks of relationships that extended far beyond their original ethnic communities. The children and grandchildren of the original exiles faced particularly complex choices. They had been born in Babylon, educated in Babylonian schools, and acculturated to Babylonian society. While they maintained their Hebrew identity, they also felt genuinely Babylonian in many ways. The prospect of returning to a homeland they had never seen was often less attractive than remaining in the only home they had ever known. From the Babylonian perspective, this was the ultimate success of their exile management policies. They had transformed a potentially rebellious population into a loyal and productive component of imperial society. They had acquired valuable human resources without provoking ongoing resistance. They had demonstrated that conquest didn't have to mean destruction. It could mean transformation and integration. The administrative records that Nabu-Ramani reviews each morning tell the story of this success. Production reports show that exile communities are contributing significantly to imperial prosperity. Cultural assessments indicate that integration is proceeding smoothly, with each generation becoming more thoroughly Babylonian while maintaining enough of their original identity to serve as bridges to their communities. Security reports show minimal resistance activities within exile populations. The combination of opportunities for advancement, protection under imperial law, and gradual cultural integration has created stable, productive communities that pose no threat to imperial security. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Babylonian exile management was its unintended consequences. By allowing exile populations to maintain their cultural identities while integrating them into imperial society, the Babylonians inadvertently created the conditions for cultural innovation and preservation that would far outlast their empire. The Hebrew texts preserved in Babylonian exile, the theological insights developed in response to displacement, the institutional innovations created to maintain identity in a foreign land, all of these became the foundation for religious and cultural traditions that would survive long after Babylon itself had crumbled into dust. The irony is profound. The Babylonians intended to absorb and transform their exile populations, making them permanent components of imperial society. Instead, they created the conditions that allowed those populations to preserve and strengthen their unique identities while developing portable forms of cultural expression that could survive any future displacement. The exile management policies that seemed so successful from the imperial perspective ultimately contributed to the creation of diaspora communities that would maintain their distinct identities for millennia. The integration strategies that were designed to prevent rebellion instead created the institutional foundations for long-term cultural survival. As the morning sun reaches its zenith over the great city of Babylon, casting sharp shadows across the administrative districts where officials like Nabu-Ramani manage the complex business of empire, we can see both the brilliance and the limitations of human systems of control. The Babylonians created one of history's most sophisticated approaches to managing conquered populations, but they could not ultimately control the deeper currents of faith, hope, and identity that sustained their exile communities. The clay tablets that record the success of Babylonian exile management tell only part of the story. The other part, the part written in the hearts and minds of the exiled, tells of a different kind of success: the preservation of hope, the maintenance of faith, and the quiet triumph of the human spirit over even the most sophisticated systems of control. In the end, the exiled communities that the Babylonians managed so carefully would outlast the empire that created them, carrying forward traditions and insights that would shape the world long after the great city of Babylon had become a memory preserved only in ancient texts. Conclusion. As we reach the end of our journey through the landscapes of exile, we find ourselves standing at the intersection of loss and hope, of displacement and preservation, of human suffering and divine faithfulness. The stories we've explored tonight, from the daily rhythms of life by Babylon's waters to the courage of Daniel in foreign courts, from the patient work of scribes preserving sacred texts to the sophisticated strategies of imperial management, all speak to the profound complexity of the human experience when home becomes a memory and survival requires adaptation. The Hebrew exiles who sat by the rivers of Babylon, who walked the corridors of power in foreign palaces, who pressed stylus to clay in dimly lit workshops, who navigated the careful balance between integration and identity. These weren't just historical figures playing out ancient dramas. They were people like us, facing questions that every generation must answer. How do we maintain our identity when everything familiar is stripped away? How do we serve earthly authorities while remaining faithful to higher loyalties? How do we preserve what matters most for future generations? How do we find meaning in circumstances we never chose? Their answers, worked out in the crucible of exile, continue to resonate across the centuries. They discovered that home isn't just a place, it's a set of values, stories, and relationships that can be carried anywhere. They learned that faithfulness often requires not dramatic gestures of resistance, but the quiet courage of daily integrity. They proved that the most powerful form of rebellion against oppression is often the simple act of refusing to let hope die. The clay tablets they created, the prayers they whispered, the children they taught, the dreams they preserved, all of these became seeds that would eventually flower into new communities, new insights, and new forms of faith that would spread throughout the ancient world and beyond. Their exile, intended to destroy their identity, instead made it more portable, more resilient, and more enduring. Perhaps most remarkably, their story reminds us that even in our darkest moments, even when we feel most alone, we are part of a larger narrative that spans generations and transcends our immediate circumstances. The God who walked with Abraham, who spoke to Moses, who inspired the prophets, who sustained the exiles in their foreign land, this same God continues to walk with us in our own seasons of displacement and uncertainty. The rivers of Babylon still flow, carrying their eternal witness to the resilience of the human spirit. The clay tablets still bear their ancient testimony to the power of hope preserved in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. The stories still speak, across the centuries, of ordinary people doing extraordinary things simply by refusing to give up on the values that define them. As you go from this place, carrying these stories with you, may you find in them not just historical interest, but personal encouragement. May you discover that the God who sustained Daniel in the lion's den, who inspired the scribes in their patient work, who heard the prayers of the exiles by foreign waters, continues to be present in your own journey, whatever form your exile may take. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of faith and history. Until we meet again in another quiet corner of the past, may you find peace in the knowledge that no exile is permanent, no displacement is final, and no act of faithfulness is ever forgotten.